Hello, everyone. Tonight, we're going to slip deep into the shadows of an unsolved disappearance. Imagine the soft orange flicker of a campfire sparks shooting up into the forest canopy, laughter bouncing off the trees, and the cool midnight air brushing against your skin. A group of friends and siblings alive with energy, sharing inside jokes, roasting marshmallows, never imagining that this would be the last time anyone would see them together. A murder mystery has occurred, and tonight we'll walk the path they did step by step. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you really like what I'm doing here. And I'd love to know, where do you live and what do you do? You never know, you might find a neighbor right here in the comments. Now turn off the lights, lie back on your comfy cushions, and let's get moving tonight. The story begins in the late summer of 1991 when five young adults decided to spend a long weekend in the depths of the Pine Hollow Forest, a sprawling, rugged woodland stretching across miles of uncharted trails and forgotten hunting grounds. This wasn't just a random trip, it was meant to be a kind of reunion. Two siblings, Daniel and his younger sister Claire, were the heart of the group. Daniel was 24, broad-shouldered and endlessly teasing the protective older brother type who always volunteered to set up the tent poles while telling the worst possible dad jokes. Claire, barely 20, was quieter, but sharp-eyed, always the one noticing when someone left a lighter behind or when the stars had shifted overhead. With them came three close friends: Marcus, their childhood neighbor with a knack for photography; Jenna, a college roommate of Claire's who had a love for campfire horror stories; and Todd, a mechanic who seemed more interested in testing his survival gear than in actually relaxing. They weren't reckless teenagers sneaking off into the woods. These were young adults, all responsible in their own way. They had maps, compasses, radios, and enough canned food to last twice the trip. On paper, this was supposed to be foolproof. The first night began like any other camping adventure. They parked Daniel's old station wagon on the edge of a dirt trail, backpacks strapped, laughter echoing as they marched into the trees. The trail was narrow with roots twisting out of the earth, and it wasn't long before the sound of distant cars was replaced by the endless hush of crickets and the far-off hoot of owls. When they reached the clearing, Marcus immediately pulled out his camera, snapping photos of the tents being set up, the fire pit being built, and Todd attempting to cook canned beans like a Michelin chef. Those photos, grainy, bright, a little overexposed, would later become eerie artifacts, the last seen alive moments frozen in time. Jenna was the first to bring up the local stories. Sitting by the fire, she leaned forward, her hair catching the orange light. "You guys know people used to say this forest eats campers, right?" she said with a mischievous grin. "Like, not literally eats them, but people vanish. Whole groups. No trace." Todd laughed it off, tossing a stick into the flames. "Yeah, and crocodile poop was used as sunscreen in ancient Egypt. Doesn't mean it's coming back anytime soon." That became a running joke for the night. Every odd sound in the trees, every snap of a twig, someone muttered, "It's the crocodile poop sunscreen guy." And just like that, the unease was buried under humor. But the locals hadn't been joking. Historical records show that Pine Hollow Forest really did have a reputation. In the late 1960s, a pair of hunters vanished during deer season. Their rifles were found leaning against a tree, but the men themselves were never located. And in 1979, two hikers were reported missing. The only evidence was a single torn bootlace caught on a branch. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether these disappearances were the work of human hands or simply tragic accidents swallowed by wilderness. But if you ask the people who lived nearby back, then they'll tell you flat out there was something in those woods. Back at the fire, the group's night stretched on. They sang half-remembered songs, passed around a dented flask, and told stories until the fire collapsed into glowing coals. Claire wrote in her small journal, scribbling quick notes about the smell of pine, the taste of slightly burned marshmallow, and how good it felt to be out of the city. She had no idea her journal would later be used by investigators as one of the only surviving records of what happened next. The firelight dimmed, their laughter softened, and the forest pressed in. It was the perfect start to a trip, or the perfect beginning to something much darker. The morning came slower than expected, like the forest itself was reluctant to let the group rise. A heavy mist clung to the clearing, wrapping the tents in a pale shroud. Birds called somewhere far off, but closer to camp, the silence felt unnerving. Daniel was the first to emerge, rubbing sleep from his eyes, stretching his arms with a groan that seemed to echo too loudly. He noticed something odd right away. There were faint impressions in the dirt near the fire pit. Not paw prints, not quite boot marks either. Something in between. He crouched, squinting, tracing the edges with his finger. Probably raccoons, he muttered to himself, though his voice lacked confidence. Claire joined him, notebook in hand. Those aren't raccoon prints, Danny. Look, too big, too straight. Todd emerged next, yawning, and immediately dismissed it. You two need coffee before you start inventing Bigfoot again. Still, it wasn't just the footprints. Marcus swore his camera had been shifted overnight. He'd left it zipped in his bag, but now it was perched on top, lens cap removed. Jenna complained that her small pack of trail mix was missing, though she admitted she might have eaten it while half asleep. And the strangest of all, Daniel's lighter, the one he always kept in his jacket pocket, was gone. At first, none of it seemed serious. Campsites get messy, things roll away, animals poke around. But the siblings exchanged looks, quiet and thoughtful. They tried to shrug it off with breakfast. Eggs cracked into a sizzling pan, instant coffee steaming in tin mugs. Jenna tried to lift the mood, launching into another ghost story about a Victorian widow haunting her husband's hunting grounds. Marcus snapped more photos, capturing the way the mist burned off in sunlight, how the trees seemed endless, but even laughter couldn't drown out the subtle tension. By mid-morning, the group decided to hike deeper into the forest, mapping the area and maybe finding a stream. Todd insisted on leading, compass in hand, while Daniel marked trees with chalk. They followed a narrow path, damp leaves sticking to their boots. The forest was thick, every direction identical. And then came the whispers. At first, it was just Marcus who heard them, a faint, low murmur like two people conversing just out of sight. He stopped, head tilted, but when he asked if anyone else noticed, they shook their heads. You're hearing wind through the branches, Jenna teased, though her voice carried a nervous edge. But Marcus wasn't so sure. He snapped a photo of the trees in that direction. Later, when investigators developed the role, that photo showed nothing but bark and shadows. Still, some who studied the images claimed they could see faint outlines, figures blurred as if in motion. As the group pressed on, they stumbled upon something stranger, a tree with a deep carving in its trunk. A spiral, precise and deliberate as though etched with a blade. Moss had grown around it, suggesting it wasn't recent. Claire traced it with her fingertip. Someone marked this, not an accident. Hunters do that all the time, Todd argued. It's just a marker. But the symbol didn't resemble any hunter's code. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the carvings were old boundary markers, ritual symbols, or the signature of someone who lived unseen in these woods. As if on cue, the forest grew quieter. No bird calls, no insects buzzing, just the crunch of their boots and the distant rush of wind. By the time they returned to camp, the sun was slipping behind the trees. Their tents looked untouched, but Daniel swore his sleeping bag was unrolled. Jenna found her shoes damp, as though someone had worn them to the river and back. The group laughed nervously about pranksters, maybe locals who didn't like outsiders camping on their land, but no one could explain how strangers could move so quietly unseen, yet leave behind such deliberate signs. That night around the fire, the jokes ran thinner. Conversations drifted into silence, each camper staring into the dark beyond the circle of light. Todd tightened his grip on his hunting knife. Marcus kept his camera close, clicking photos at random intervals. The forest whispered again, though this time more than one of them heard it. Low winding, as if words were being spoken, but just out of understanding. And all the while, in the shifting glow of firelight, the carved spiral lingered in their minds. The night dragged into a restless dawn. None of them slept well, and it showed. Daniel's eyes were bloodshot. Claire's notebook lay open with scribbles more frantic than thoughtful, and Jenna had dark smudges beneath her eyes, proof that her horror stories had come back to haunt her in dreams. When Daniel finally crawled out of his tent, he froze. The footprints were back, fresh ones pressed deep into the soft soil. They weren't the same as before. These were clearer, longer strides, as though whoever or whatever made them had circled the tents deliberately. Someone's messing with us, he muttered, clenching his jaw. Claire knelt beside him, brushing her fingers over the marks. But where did they go? Look, the prints just stop, like they vanished. And she was right. The trail of prints circled the camp twice, then cut off abruptly as if the figure had dissolved into the earth. Todd didn't like it one bit. He grabbed his knife, muttering something about setting traps. Marcus snapped another photo of the ground, though he confessed his camera roll was nearly full. Later, that image would puzzle investigators. The footprints looked wider in the photograph than they did in reality, stretched like something had distorted the lens without his noticing. Breakfast was quick, nervous bites of granola bars and sips of bitter coffee. They had planned a hike to the ridge, but the unease kept them closer to camp. By mid-morning, an argument broke out. Jenna swore she heard a voice whisper her name in the night. Daniel insisted she'd just been dreaming, but Claire backed her up, admitting she too had heard faint words, something about leaving. Todd scoffed, running a hand through his messy hair. This is paranoia. Look, historically, forests like these always get a reputation. Remember the Roanoke colony. Whole community vanished, no bodies. Some say disease, some say violence, others blame spirits. People love mysteries. It was a fair point, one of the most infamous unsolved disappearances in American history. But his words didn't settle their nerves. They just reminded everyone that being swallowed was more than folklore. By noon, the group tried to shake off the tension with activity. They wandered a little, following what looked like a deer trail. The path twisted strangely, leading them in circles until they came back to their own clearing without meaning to. That doesn't make sense, Marcus muttered, flipping his compass. We were heading east, but the compass needle twitched, unnaturally spinning for a moment before righting itself. Todd cursed, tapping it against his palm, though it offered no real explanation. The strangest detail came when Claire stopped abruptly, pointing toward the tree line. There, faintly etched into the bark of another oak, was the spiral again. Same size, same careful lines, as if someone had copied the exact same carving miles apart. Her hand trembled as she touched it. We're not imagining this. That evening they sat tighter around the fire. Marcus had grown quieter, staring off into the dark more than joking. Jenna clutched a blanket to her chest, while Claire wrote frantically in her notebook, capturing every detail. And then it happened. Around midnight, Daniel jolted awake. The fire had burned low, just embers glowing. He swore he heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, just outside the circle of tents. He grabbed his flashlight, flicked it on, and swept the beam across the trees. Nothing, just branches and mist. But when he lowered the light, he froze. A shadow shifted between trunks. Too tall, too human-shaped. He blinked, and it was gone. The next morning, the group was frayed. Paranoia crept into their conversations, their laughter now brittle. Even Todd, the skeptic, seemed uneasy. He kept his knife close at all times. And then came the final straw. Marcus opened his camera bag and discovered one of his film canisters missing. It hadn't fallen out. The zipper was closed. Someone had taken it. The group fell silent, eyes darting to one another. Suspicion bloomed like poison. Which one of you thinks this is funny? Marcus demanded. But no one confessed. The siblings, Daniel and Claire, exchanged a quiet glance. Neither said it aloud, but both thought the same thing: someone was watching them. And if that was true, then the question wasn't whether they would vanish, but when. The morning light did little to wash away the unease. Instead of clarity, it sharpened every small detail into something menacing. Claire noticed the trees seemed closer, the air heavier. Daniel, who normally cracked jokes to keep spirits high, barely spoke at all. They decided to hike again this time, not for fun, but for answers. If someone was stalking them, there had to be signs: a cabin, a camp, maybe even another trail. Todd led the way with his compass, muttering to himself when the needle twitched again. Claire kept scribbling notes, her journal filling with hurried sketches of spirals and strange footprints. The forest seemed to toy with them. Paths bent back on themselves. Shadows stretched the wrong way, as if the sun itself was conspiring. It wasn't long before Jenna spotted something carved into another tree. Not a spiral this time, but a series of sharp lines forming what looked like a tally mark. 5 cuts, clean and deliberate. 5, she whispered. There are 5 of us. Daniel shook his head, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow. It's just kids fooling around. Graffiti in the woods. But his voice cracked at the edges, and everyone noticed. By late afternoon, they reached a part of the forest they hadn't seen before, a patch of land where the ground dipped into a shallow hollow. The soil there was blackened as though burned. Todd crouched, scooping ash between his fingers. Someone lit a fire here recently, he said. Not campers. Too much char, not enough leftover wood. Marcus raised his camera, snapping another shot, but the film jammed, clicking uselessly. He cursed, fumbling, when Jenna tugged on his sleeve. Look, she whispered. On the far side of the hollow, barely visible between the trees, was another carving. This one wasn't etched into bark. It was painted. Red lines smeared crudely in a circle with what looked like dripping edges. Blood, Claire asked. Todd sniffed the air. No smell. Probably paint. But why here? That question lingered sour and unanswered as they returned to camp. Night fell quickly, as though the forest had snapped its fingers. The fire crackled, but no one dared tell stories anymore. Instead, they listened to twigs snapping just beyond reach, to the rustle of leaves, when no wind stirred, to the faint trickle of water that seemed to come from nowhere. And then came the path. Jenna spotted it first, glinting faintly in the firelight. A narrow trail leading away from their clearing, a trail that none of them had seen before. It looked fresh, as if cut by heavy boots. That wasn't there yesterday, she said. Daniel grabbed his flashlight, shining it down the line. It bent quickly into darkness, impossible to see where it led. Claire's voice was quiet, almost pleading. We shouldn't follow it. But curiosity battled with fear. Todd argued they needed to know if someone was leading them, while Marcus snapped another photo before the light faded. The camera shutter echoed like a warning. No one followed the path that night. Instead, they tightened their circle backs to the fire eyes on the trees. Around 2 a.m, Daniel swore he saw a faint glow in the distance. Not fire, not flashlight, something duller, like a lantern swinging. It moved along the unseen path, swaying gently until it disappeared behind the trees. He didn't mention it until morning. When daylight came, he told them everything: the glow, the movement, the way it seemed deliberate. Jenna paled, clutching her blanket tighter. Claire looked at her brother for a long moment, then whispered, If they're showing us the path, maybe they want us to follow. The group fell into silence, each one realizing the same dreadful truth. Someone was leading them deeper, and once you notice a path that wasn't there before, it never truly disappears. The morning air was colder, sharper, as though the forest itself had shifted overnight. Daniel felt it before he opened his eyes, a tightness in his chest, a dread that had nothing to do with dreams. When he finally crawled out of his tent, the world looked off-kilter. Claire was already outside, staring at the edge of camp with her notebook clutched against her chest. Her face was pale. Danny, she whispered, Marcus is gone. The words landed like a stone. At first, Daniel thought she was joking, some cruel attempt at keeping the group on edge. But when he checked Marcus's tent, the truth was undeniable. Sleeping bag, unzipped camera bag, left behind tripod, still leaning against the pole. His boots were gone, but nothing else. Jenna's scream ripped through the clearing when she realized. Todd stormed around the camp, shouting Marcus's name, his voice bouncing off the trees. No answer. The group huddled together, panic thrumming beneath their skin. Marcus wasn't the type to wander. He was meticulous, always counting his film canisters, double-checking his bag. Even if he had left to relieve himself, he would have taken his flashlight. But the flashlight was still there, lying beside his bedroll. Maybe Daniel started, but he couldn't finish. There were too many holes in that theory. They searched anyway, yelling his name, combing the immediate area, checking along the new trail that had appeared the night before. But the forest swallowed their voices whole. Not even an echo returned. Hours slipped by. The sun climbed, then sank, dragging their hope with it. When they regrouped, Claire's hands were shaking so badly she could barely write. She'd found something, a scrap of fabric snagged on a branch. It was from Marcus's jacket, the plaid one he wore everywhere. The edges were torn, not cut, pulled. Jenna's sobs came in waves, muffled by her hands. Todd cursed loudly, kicking at the dirt. Daniel tried to stay calm, tried to keep his voice steady, but his eyes kept darting to the spiral carvings on the trees, as though expecting them to multiply. That night the fire was no comfort. It threw shadows too deep, too jagged, and every sound felt amplified. At one point, Todd stood suddenly, brandishing his knife. Someone's out there, he hissed, but when they all turned flashlights, cutting across the dark, nothing was there, just empty woods. Claire leaned close to her brother, whispering, Danny, what if this isn't an accident? What if someone's taking us? Daniel wanted to dismiss it, wanted to say it was paranoia, But he remembered the lantern glow from the night before the path that hadn't existed until it did, and for the first time he couldn't bring himself to deny it. Sometime past midnight, Jenna swore she heard Marcus's voice calling her name. Soft, almost kind, from somewhere beyond the firelight. She bolted upright, clutching her blanket, staring into the dark. Daniel and Todd rushed to stop her as she tried to move toward it. "Let me go," she cried, tears streaking her cheeks. "He needs me. He's out there." But when Todd swept his flashlight across the trees, the forest was still, silent, empty. By morning, Jenna wouldn't speak. She just sat close to the fire, rocking slightly, clutching Marcus's abandoned camera as though it might bring him back. And in the dirt, just beyond the circle of their camp, new footprints appeared. Not Marcus's. Wider, heavier, leading away into the trees. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether Marcus truly wandered off or was taken in the night. But the surviving campers never had any doubt someone had entered their camp and chosen him. By the time the sun dragged itself into the sky, the group was already unraveling. Sleep had become impossible. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of branches set their nerves alight. Marcus's absence hung over them like a physical weight, pressing the air so tightly that even breathing felt like effort. Daniel tried to assert control, to be the older brother, the anchor. He gathered everyone close, speaking low, trying to keep the panic out of his voice. "We stay together," he said firmly. "No wandering off, no chasing voices in the dark. Whoever or whatever is messing with us, they want to split up. We don't give them that." Todd nodded reluctantly, knife still gripped in his fist. Jenna didn't respond, her eyes glazed, clutching Marcus's camera to her chest. Claire scribbled Daniel's words into her notebook as though recording them might make them stronger. They decided to search again, but this time in daylight. Todd insisted on following the fresh footprints that appeared overnight. They were deeper, heavier than Marcus's, leading away from camp into a part of the forest where the trees grew denser. Every step forward felt like a mistake. The air cooled unnaturally, the canopy thickening until the sky itself was nearly gone. Then they saw it. At first it looked like a shadow, but as they drew closer, the outline, sharpened branches bent into unnatural arches, forming what looked like a crude doorway in the woods. The footprints led straight through. Jenna whimpered, clinging to Daniel's arm. "We can't go in there. Please." Todd gritted his teeth. "If Marcus is alive, we don't have a choice." They stepped through. On the other side, the forest changed. The trees were marked more heavily here, each trunk bearing spirals, tally marks, and other symbols they couldn't decipher. Some were painted, others carved so deeply the wood bled sap. Claire stopped, pointing to one tree in particular. On its surface was a carving unlike the others, 5 figures stick-like standing side by side. One of them had been slashed through. Her voice trembled. "That's us." Daniel's chest tightened, but before he could speak, Todd motioned for silence. He pointed ahead. Through the trees, faintly glowing in the dim light, was a lantern. It swayed slowly, hanging from a low branch. The flame inside flickered, casting just enough light to reveal more footprints on the ground, too many to count. But no person was holding it. Todd stepped forward, cautiously reaching out. When his fingers brushed the metal, the lantern snuffed out instantly, plunging them back into shadow. And then the sounds began. Branches snapping, leaves crunching. Not from one direction, but from all around them. Jenna screamed, clutching Marcus's camera, while Claire scribbled frantically in her notebook. "They're here. They're watching." Daniel grabbed her wrist. "Run." They bolted back through the arch, crashing into the clearing, hearts pounding. No one looked back, afraid of what they might see. When they finally stumbled into camp, gasping for breath, they realized the fire was gone. The circle of ashes was cold, as if no flame had burned there in days, and worse, the tents were unzipped, ransacked. Claire's journal, Marcus's extra rolls of film, even Todd's survival kit, all gone. It was as if someone had walked straight into their lives and stripped away everything that tethered them to safety. That night, the group didn't even try to sleep. They huddled together in the center of camp, watching the tree line. At some point past midnight, the whispering returned, louder this time, distinct. Daniel swore he heard his own name. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether these voices were hallucinations fueled by exhaustion or evidence that someone truly lingered just beyond sight. But for the 4 left alive, it didn't matter. because they knew the forest wasn't empty and Marcus wasn't coming back. Morning offered no comfort. It was as though the sun itself had decided to abandon them, the light thin and gray filtering weakly through the canopy. The forest felt heavier, and every breath seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes. Daniel counted them silently. 4. Just 4 now. The number pulsed in his chest like a wound. Jenna barely moved, sitting with Marcus's camera clutched to her chest. Her lips moved in whispers no one could understand. Todd tried to rouse her, shaking her shoulder, but she shoved him away with surprising force. "He's still out there," she hissed. "I heard him. He called my name." Todd exchanged a grim look with Daniel, but neither dared argue. The decision was made without words. They had to leave. Whatever supplies were missing, whatever strange footprints taunted them, they couldn't stay. Todd insisted on leading, again, compass in one hand, knife in the other. Daniel kept Claire close, watching every branch, every shift of shadow. The trail twisted strangely. Twice they thought they were heading west, only to find themselves back at the hollow where they'd seen the painted spiral. Claire scribbled furiously in her notebook, drawing crude maps, but the lines never made sense. By midday, they stumbled across something new, a pile of stones stacked deliberately in the middle of the path. 5 stones balanced carefully. Todd kicked them over with a growl. "I'm sick of their games." But when the rocks tumbled, something clattered out from between them, a button. Daniel picked it up slowly, his heart sinking. It was Marcus's. Jenna lunged forward, snatching it from his hand. She pressed it to her lips, trembling. "He left it for me. He's alive." Daniel wanted to believe her, but the button was torn, frayed, as though ripped away in struggle. They pressed on their nerves, unraveling thread by thread. That night, when the fire was little more than a flicker, Jenna slipped away. No one noticed at first. She had been so quiet, rocking back and forth with Marcus's camera. But when Claire looked up, she saw the blanket lying empty. "Jenna," she called, her voice breaking. Panic surged. Daniel and Todd grabbed flashlights, scanning the perimeter. Then they heard it, a scream, sharp and sudden, cut off mid-breath. They ran toward it, crashing through the brush. The beam of Daniel's flashlight cut across the trees until it landed on something that froze his blood. The camera, Marcus's camera. It lay in the dirt, lens cracked, strap torn. But Jenna was gone. The 3 remaining stood there, chests heaving, the forest swallowing every sound. Claire crouched, reaching for the camera, her fingers trembling. When she lifted it, she gasped. The film had been rewound. Someone had taken new photos. Later, when investigators developed the roll, they would find a series of images, blurred shots of the campers sleeping in their tents, close-ups of their faces illuminated by firelight, and one final image, Jenna, eyes wide, mouth open as though caught mid-scream. Back in the moment, Daniel forced them back to camp, dragging Claire, while Todd stormed behind, cursing into the dark. They didn't speak of the photo possibilities. They didn't dare. Only 3 now. And the spiral carvings, they were closer, fresh, as though etched while the group was out searching. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether Jenna followed a hallucination, whether she ran into the woods willingly, or whether someone lured her with Marcus's voice. But Daniel, Claire, and Todd knew. She hadn't left them. She'd been taken. 3 left. The silence after Jenna's disappearance was suffocating, heavier than the screams that had torn through the trees hours before. Daniel counted them again and again, 3 bodies, 3 shallow breaths, 3 figures clinging to the smallest light of a fire that seemed weaker with every passing moment. Todd paced relentlessly, blade flashing in the dim glow, his boots tearing paths in the dirt. "They're hunting us," he muttered, not caring if the others heard, "picking us off one by one. First Marcus, then Jenna. Next it'll be one of us." Claire rocked with her notebook in hand, scribbling faster than ever, the paper covered in spirals and names. "No, no, no," she whispered. "Not if we leave, not if we keep moving. If we walk fast enough, they can't follow. If we change our direction every hour, they'll lose us. That's how people escape." Daniel wanted to believe her, but exhaustion had eaten through the thin threads of logic that bound them together. His muscles ached, his eyes burned, and his mind throbbed with questions he couldn't silence. Still, he pushed them onward. At dawn, the forest seemed determined to trap them. Every path curved back to familiar ground. A fallen log they had passed yesterday reappeared again. Even the moss on the trees seemed to switch sides, as if the woods were alive, rearranging itself behind their backs. By midday, Todd exploded. He hurled his compass against a rock, shattering the glass. It's useless, we're going in circles. Daniel tried to calm him, but Todd's face twisted with something close to rage. You're the one leading us in circles. You think you're keeping us safe, you're not. People keep dying under your watch, Daniel. Claire flinched at the sharpness of his tone, clutching her notebook tighter. Daniel opened his mouth to argue, but then he froze. Ahead in the clearing stood something that should not have been there, a cabin. It was small, made of weathered wood, leaning as though a single push might send it tumbling. Smoke trickled from the chimney, curling faintly into the gray sky. Claire gasped, hope flashing in her eyes. Someone lives here, we can get help. But Todd shook his head, his jaw set. No, this is wrong, too convenient, too staged. Still, their feet carried them closer. Hunger gnawed at their insides, thirst burned their throats, and desperation whispered that even the wrong place was better than no place. The cabin door creaked open when Daniel pushed it. Inside, the air was stale, filled with dust and the faint metallic tang of rust. Shelves lined the walls, holding jars filled with murky liquid and shapes too distorted to recognize. Claire backed up, pressing herself against Daniel's shoulder. What? What is this? Todd stepped inside, scanning the shelves with narrowed eyes. He reached out, grabbing one jar, and held it up to the light. Inside floated something pale with tiny fingers. He dropped it instantly, the glass shattering on the floor. The liquid spread across the wooden boards, reeking. On the table in the center of the room lay photographs. Dozens of them spread like playing cards. All of campers. Not just Marcus, Jenna, Claire, Todd, and Daniel, but others. Faces they didn't recognize, some smiling, some blurred. And in every photograph, one figure was always circled in red. Claire's hands shook as she picked one up. Her voice cracked. This is real. We're not the first. A sudden slam echoed through the cabin, the door snapping shut. The faint light dimmed, and from outside footsteps circled. Daniel shoved them toward the back window, his heart hammering. Move! Todd smashed the glass with his knife, dragging Claire through as Daniel climbed after. They bolted into the forest, not daring to look back, not daring to imagine who or what had trapped them inside. When they finally stopped gasping for breath, Claire spoke first. We have to tell someone. We have to get out and tell the world. But Todd shook his head, pale and trembling. No one's going to believe us. They'll say we got lost, panicked, that Jenna ran away, that Marcus wandered off. We're already ghosts, Claire. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the cabin truly existed or if the trio hallucinated it in their delirium. But the photographs that surfaced later, unearthed in the police archives, suggest otherwise. Someone had been watching, and someone had chosen. The forest had teeth now. Every step forward felt like walking into the jaws of something waiting to snap shut. Daniel kept counting 3, still 3, but he no longer trusted the number. People vanished too quickly here. That night, they built no fire. They huddled close together beneath a fallen tree, listening to the forest breathe. Every few minutes, a twig snapped or a low whistle threaded through the dark. None of them dared speak. Claire clutched her notebook, scribbling even in the darkness. When Daniel finally caught a glimpse of the page, his stomach turned. She wasn't writing words anymore, just spirals drawn over and over until the paper tore. At dawn, she was gone. Daniel woke, first cold dew soaking his clothes, and felt the hollow where she had been. He bolted upright, panic surging. Todd stirred with a growl, ready to snap, but when he saw the empty space, the color drained from his face. They searched, though they both knew it was pointless. Her notebook lay abandoned near the log. The last page was filled with a single line scrawled in frantic, uneven script, "I'm going where the voices lead." And beside it, pressed into the paper so hard it ripped through, was another spiral. Todd punched the tree in fury, his knuckles splitting. She was right here. She was right here. Daniel pressed the notebook to his chest, unable to answer. He felt the forest closing in, reducing them, thinning them, until soon there would be nothing left. Only two. They walked without speaking. Hunger was sharp now, thirst unbearable. Twice Daniel thought he saw Claire ahead, just a flicker of her blonde hair between the trees, but every time he ran forward there was nothing. By late afternoon they stumbled upon something new, a clearing where the ground had been disturbed. Piles of earth mounded crudely, stretching in uneven rows. Graves. Todd stood frozen, his face pale. This isn't natural. Daniel knelt, brushing away dirt from one mound. Beneath the soil was fabric torn, faded, but unmistakably human. He dropped it instantly, bile rising in his throat. Todd turned away, gagging. We have to get out. We have to get out now. But the forest didn't allow exits. When they turned back, the path they had taken was gone, swallowed by dense brush. That night, without fire, without shelter, Daniel and Todd pressed their backs together, knives in hand, eyes wide. Neither dared close them. And then voices, clearer than ever, whispering their names. Todd stood, shaking, his blade raised. Do you hear that they're calling me? Daniel grabbed his arm, desperate. Don't listen, it's a trick. But Todd's eyes were glassy, unfocused. He pulled free and staggered into the trees. I'm not afraid of you. You hear me? I'm not afraid. The words echoed, then cut short. Daniel waited, trembling, listening for Todd to return. He never did. Only one now. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether Todd succumbed to paranoia and ran blindly into the woods, or whether someone or something guided him there. But Daniel, left alone with the graves, with the notebook of spirals, and with the whispers curling closer, knew the truth in his bones. The forest was feeding. Only Daniel remained. The night pressed against him like a living thing, suffocating and endless. He crouched low beside the mounds of earth, knife trembling in his grip, his breath shallow, as though even exhaling too loudly might summon whatever moved beyond the trees. He whispered names to himself, Marcus, Jenna, Claire, Todd, as if repeating them could anchor their existence, keep them from dissolving completely into the soil that had swallowed so many before. But the forest answered back in kind, twisting their names into echoes that didn't sound quite human. By morning, Daniel was delirious. Hunger clawed at him. Thirst seared his throat, and exhaustion blurred the world into fragments. Still, he staggered forward. There had to be a way out. The path wound through unfamiliar ground. The carvings on the trees grew denser, spirals layered upon spirals until bark barely showed through. At one point, he stumbled upon another marker, a circle of stones inside of which lay scraps of clothing, a shirt sleeve, a shoelace. A strip of fabric Daniel recognized instantly, Todd's bandana. His knees buckled, but he forced himself up, pushing deeper into the forest. By dusk, he saw light flickering through the trees, not firelight, something steadier, warmer, a town. He stumbled into the edge of it, collapsing on the roadside as headlights flared. A passing truck screeched to a halt, and the driver rushed out, shouting. Daniel tried to respond, but only managed a hoarse rasp before blacking out. When he awoke, it was in a hospital bed. Bright white sheets, antiseptic air, the beep of a heart monitor. He was safe, or so he thought. Police arrived quickly. They questioned him for hours, demanding details. Where had his friends gone? How had he survived alone? Why were his clothes torn and blood-stained? Daniel told them everything, the voices, the spirals, the cabin with jars, the photographs, the graves. He begged them to search the woods. But when officers returned from their sweep, they reported nothing. No cabin, no graves, no spirals carved into trees, no trace of Jenna, Marcus, Claire, or Todd, only Daniel's footprints. The police filed it under missing persons, but suspicion turned swiftly toward Daniel himself. Was he unstable? Had he harmed his friends in some psychotic break? Investigators debated, whispering in corners where they thought he couldn't hear. Daniel's parents took him home eventually, but whispers followed everywhere. Reporters hounded him, neighbors watched him with unease, and online forums lit up with theories: the jealous brother, the lone survivor, the murderer who spun ghost stories to cover his tracks. Through it all, Daniel clung to one thing, Claire's notebook, which he had carried out of the forest. Most of its pages were spirals, but the final one contained a single phrase, scrawled shakily in her handwriting: the forest remembers. Late at night, when sleep refused to come, Daniel flipped through the notebook, tracing the spirals, until dizziness overtook him. Sometimes faintly, he thought he could still hear voices outside his window, whispers threading through the night air calling his name. Investigators and detectives are still debating the case even today. Some insist Daniel was guilty, that the lack of physical evidence proves he fabricated the story. Others argue the missing campers fell victim to exposure, and Daniel invented the forest horrors to mask his guilt. But a smaller group believes something else, that the forest itself was alive, that it claimed those who entered, and that Daniel's escape was not survival but release, for now, because forests have long memories, and they never forget the ones who got away. The world outside the forest should have been brighter, safer, louder. But for Daniel, it was none of those things. Weeks passed, yet the forest stayed with him. It lingered in his ears, the crunch of leaves, the low hum of voices. It lingered in his dreams, Marcus calling Jenna, screaming Claire's spirals, tightening into a noose around his throat. And it lingered in his waking life, too. Reporters circled like vultures. They wanted blood, whether truth or fabrication. Articles branded him the soul camper, some painting him a tragic figure, others a monster. Talk shows speculated openly about whether Daniel had snapped under the pressure of sibling rivalry, killing Marcus and covering it with a supernatural story. But behind the sensationalism, a small group of investigators refused to let go. They combed archives, finding threads that stretched back decades, other missing campers, other strange disappearances in the same stretch of forest, hikers who left no trace, hunters whose rifles were later found leaning against trees but with no bodies nearby. Daniel followed these reports obsessively. He began clipping articles, filling his wall with maps and notes. The spirals Claire once drew now dotted his papers, circled in red ink. He wasn't trying to replicate her madness, he was trying to decode it. But with each passing day, his grip on reality frayed. At night, objects in his room shifted. He swore his lamp moved 6 inches to the left. When he woke, his notebook pages filled with scribbles he couldn't remember writing. His mother found him one morning sitting on the floor, tracing spirals into the carpet, with his fingertip whispering Marcus's name over and over. The police eventually closed the case, citing lack of evidence. To them, the missing 4 had simply joined the long line of unsolved disappearances that haunted rural America. But Daniel couldn't accept that. One evening, after weeks of silence, his phone buzzed with an unknown number. He answered shakily. A voice rasped through the line. "Danny." He froze. His brother's voice. "Marcus." Static swallowed the rest, followed by a sound like branches snapping. Then the line went dead. Daniel dropped the phone, his chest heaving. He knew what it meant. They were still out there, or something wearing their voices was. The next morning he packed a bag. Flashlight, knife, food rations, Claire's notebook. His parents begged him not to go, but Daniel barely heard them. He returned to the tree line with shaking hands and bloodshot eyes staring into the shadows. He whispered to himself, "The forest remembers." And he stepped back in. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether Daniel re-entered the forest willingly, driven by guilt, or whether he was lured by forces beyond comprehension. What's undeniable is this: he vanished the second time too. No footprints, no belongings, nothing but the whisper of leaves in the wind, and another missing person poster stapled to the town's bulletin board. This time his face was the one circled in red. The official record says Daniel disappeared on a mild spring morning. Locals remember him walking down the empty main street carrying a worn backpack, muttering to himself. Some claim he was whispering names: Marcus, Jenna, Claire, Todd. Others insist he was repeating a single phrase like a prayer: "I'll bring them back." He was last seen near the bus depot, but no ticket was sold in his name. No driver remembered him boarding. Instead, a farmer on the outskirts swore he spotted a lone figure striding toward the tree line at dusk. After that, nothing. The search for Daniel was larger than the first. Police volunteers, even private investigators, combed the forest. For weeks, the woods echoed with the sound of dogs barking, men calling, helicopters thudding overhead. But the forest gave up no secrets. Not one footprint, not one scrap of clothing. Only spirals, carved fresh into the bark, clustered around trees the search parties swore were bare days earlier. Some investigators laughed it off as a prank, locals stirring the pot of superstition. Others weren't so sure. One deputy resigned after following what he described as a new trail of carvings that seemed to appear as he walked. The strangest discovery came from a group of hikers weeks later. Deep in the woods, far from marked trails, they found an old disposable camera resting on a stump. The film was intact. When developed, the photos showed blurry shots of the forest, mostly unremarkable. But the last 3 images froze every viewer cold. The first, Daniel standing in the trees, face gaunt, eyes wide as though someone else was holding the camera. The second, a group shot: Marcus, Jenna, Claire, Todd, and Daniel, all smiling stiffly, their bodies slightly translucent, as if the film couldn't quite capture them. The third just the spiral, larger, darker, consuming the entire frame. Police filed the photos away, but rumors spread. Conspiracy forums exploded, debating whether the images were authentic or staged. Investigators and detectives are still debating how the camera could have survived in such conditions or how it turned up miles from where Daniel was last seen. Meanwhile, the town leaned into the legend. The vanishing campers became local lore. Tourists bought trinkets etched with spirals, ghost tours trudged into the woods at night, and storytellers whispered that if you listened closely, you could hear Daniel's voice in the wind calling you deeper. But those who lived closest to the tree line weren't laughing. Dogs barked at nothing, doors slammed without reason, and sometimes, just sometimes, neighbors swore they saw figures standing at the forest's edge, 5 of them, waiting. By the following year, the story of the vanishing campers had become an obsession far beyond the small town. Podcasts dissected every known detail, YouTube channels reenacted the events, and message boards filled with maps, theories, and arguments that spiraled endlessly, just like the carvings themselves. Some treated it like a ghost story, others like a true crime case gone cold. A smaller, more vocal group insisted it was evidence of something larger, a hidden cult, government experiments, or even proof of the supernatural. And then came the tape. A hiker in the national park found it wedged between 2 rocks near a stream, a battered handheld camcorder wrapped in plastic that had partially rotted away. Most of the footage was water-damaged, impossible to make out, but the final 10 minutes were clear enough to stir the case back into chaos. The footage began with Daniel, pale and thin, staring into the camera. He looked older, more worn, though he couldn't have been gone more than a few months. His voice was ragged, his words deliberate. "They don't let you leave," he said. "Not really. You think you're walking out, but the forest just bends back on itself. They show you things, faces, voices, and you start to forget who's alive and who isn't." He looked over his shoulder, eyes darting nervously, then leaned closer. "If you find this, don't follow me, don't look for us, we're already theirs." The camera shook as Daniel started moving, running through the trees. Branches whipped across the lens, light flickered, and faint whispers bled into the audio. Marcus's voice, Jenna's laughter, Claire's pleading, Todd's anger. Finally, Daniel dropped the camera to the ground. The last frame showed his boots retreating into the shadows. Behind him, faintly visible, were 4 other figures following. The tape ended. When investigators released the footage, the debates reignited. Skeptics claimed it was an elaborate hoax staged by pranksters hoping to cash in on the myth, but experts verified the camcorder's age and water damage. No clear conclusion was reached. What couldn't be ignored was the detail that shook even the skeptics, the background of the final frame. Behind the 5 figures carved into the bark of a massive tree was a fresh spiral, larger than any before, for locals that sealed it. The vanishing campers weren't gone. They were part of the forest now, and the forest was still growing hungry. As the years passed, the forest developed a reputation darker than any folklore could invent. Rangers avoided certain trails. Campers canceled trips after a single night. Even hunters, men and women who prided themselves on fearlessness, whispered about hearing voices that weren't theirs. And then people started to vanish again. Not in groups, not all at once, but one at a time. A college student who strayed too far while hiking alone. A fisherman whose boat washed ashore empty but for his tackle box. A pair of children chasing their dog toward the tree line. Each disappearance chipped away at the boundary between myth and reality. Investigators noted a pattern in almost every case. Spirals were found nearby, scratched into dirt, carved into bark, etched on rocks with impossible precision. The media pounced. Old footage of Daniel's recovered tapes circulated alongside fresh interviews with grieving families. Paranormal researchers descended on the town, setting up cameras, sensors, and infrared lights, convinced they would capture evidence of the unseen. Nothing definitive ever emerged, but the whispers grew louder. One autumn, during a particularly aggressive search effort, officers stumbled upon something that made seasoned men go pale. Deep in the woods, arranged in a perfect circle, stood 5 crude effigies, made of branches lashed together, dressed in tattered scraps of fabric. Each effigy bore a crude carving on its chest, the initials MJCT and D. Daniel and his friends. The effigies were burned immediately, but the circle where they had stood remained blackened for months. Nothing grew there, not moss, not weeds, not even fungus. Claire's old notebook resurfaced during this time, too. It had been sealed in evidence since the original case, but when a researcher finally examined it under ultraviolet light, new writing appeared between the spirals. Faint, shaky lines spelling words only visible under the glow. It doesn't end. The phrase repeated dozens of times. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the ultraviolet writing was there all along, or whether someone tampered with the evidence. But for those who already believed it was undeniable proof the campers had become part of something larger, something endless. The forest had marked them, and now it was marking others. By winter, locals began reporting figures at the edge of the tree line again. Not vague shadows this time, but clearer shapes. 5 of them moving together, pausing to watch before melting back into the pines. Every witness described the same thing: they didn't look quite solid. Their outlines shimmered blurred as though they belonged half to this world and half to something else. And in every account, one figure was always at the front, taller, more deliberate, his face hidden in shadow, but his voice unmistakable, calling for his brother. The legend of the Vanishing Campers eventually became something more than a story. It became a cycle. Each new disappearance folded neatly into the narrative, feeding the belief that the forest itself was orchestrating the pattern. By now, locals spoke of it with the resigned certainty of whether it comes, it goes, and it always returns. Tourists arrived hoping for a thrill, snapping photos at the tree line, carving their own spirals in mockery. Some made it back to town with nothing but stories. Others didn't return at all. The spiral became a symbol appearing in graffiti across abandoned barns, painted onto signs by pranksters, printed on t-shirts by opportunists. But for the families of the missing, it wasn't a game. Each sighting of a new spiral near the woods was a fresh wound. One night, years after Daniel's second disappearance, a hunter swore he captured something impossible on his trail camera. The image showed 5 figures moving in single file through the trees. They weren't solid, blurred, translucent, yet distinct enough to identify. 4 looked as if they were following, hesitant, tethered. The 5th led them, face hidden, hand outstretched, as though guiding the rest. When authorities examined the SD card, the photo had vanished, leaving only static, and so the story stretched on. Researchers still argue whether the events were the result of human violence, psychological collapse, or something older and stranger than either. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether Daniel was a murderer, a victim, or a messenger carrying proof of the impossible. But in the town closest to the forest, people don't debate, they warn. They say the spiral isn't just a mark, it's a door. Once you've seen it, you're already halfway through. On quiet nights when the wind is still, locals close their windows and bar their doors, because that's when the voices carry farthest, whispering names that don't belong to anyone in town. Marcus, Jenna, Claire, Todd, Daniel, 5 voices, calling. And sometimes if you're close enough to the trees, you'll hear them calling yours too. The forest is quiet now, or so it seems, but legends like this never die, not really. They shift, they change, they pass from one generation to the next, until no one remembers where the truth ends and the myth begins. Maybe the Vanishing Campers were just victims of cruel chance, lost in the woods, their bodies never recovered. Maybe Daniel's paranoia built a story too powerful for anyone to resist. Or maybe the forest really does take what it wants, feeding on fear, pulling people into its spirals one by one until nothing is left but silence. We may never know. And perhaps that's the point. Mystery survives because answers don't. What we do know is this: the story leaves an imprint. People who've heard it once often find themselves returning, not physically, but in thought, in daydreams, in late-night whispers, in the eerie sense that the forest is closer than it should be. And if you ever find yourself on a trail that feels too quiet, if you ever notice carvings that weren't there before, if you ever hear your name spoken in the wind when no one else is near, remember Daniel's warning. They don't let you leave. Not really. Now let your eyes grow heavy. Let the sound of my voice fade. The story is done for tonight, but the forest is still out there waiting. Always waiting. Good night.